Welcome to class number 9 for Hebrew 1 and 2. Today we're going to be getting into verbs with some introductory material that will apply to all verbs, and then beginning to look at the first verb stem, the cal stem, in the strong perfect verb. So let's jump in. The Hebrew verb system is based upon a pattern of vowels and consonants established on the theory that there are 3 consonants to a verb. There are, of course, exceptions to this, such as biconsonantal verbs that have 2 consonants. Sometimes these are referred to as hollow verbs because of the presence of a vowel that will show up in between the 2 consonants. Others have 3, but only 2 of the consonants will appear, such as geminate verbs. We'll be looking at the exceptions over time, but we will mostly be working with the assumption that there are 3 letters in a verbal root. We've already seen some of these verbal roots, such as the verb malak, from men, lamed, kaf, that we also see in the words king, queen, and kingdom. Now we're going to be looking at it as the verb, and how this particular verb and other verbs are conjugated and inflected in order to communicate meaning. We also inflect and conjugate our verbs in English, and we do it in a way very similar to Hebrew, where we maintain our consonantal root and change the vowels. Thus we have past, present, future, participle, infinitive, all rendered by different vowels within the root. Sing, sang, sung, was sung, will sing, have sung, you call that singing. Hebrew will do the exact same. The root of the consonant in the strong verb will actually stay the same. It is the vowels and the surrounding elements that will change, thereby inflecting the verb. This is the world's most misleading Hebrew chart, and I say misleading because sometimes this chart is presented as though it is always true, and it is not always true. In fact, it's not even mostly always true. Many times there are verbs that prefer a particular stem, such as davar, which prefers to always be in the PL, but is not actually intensive action. However, there is enough of a general pattern some of the time that it is helpful to memorize this chart. This is the world's most misleading verb chart, part 2, in part, again, because there are particular verbs that simply do not follow the pattern as it's presented here. However, you can see how the different verbs are inflected or conjugated based upon the emphasis that is being made in the verb. You'll also notice, though, that we cannot find one verb that would fit all 8 stems. So in that case, it is misleading to assume that this is always true. It's a general pattern, it should be understood as general, but it is not always true. Moving forward, it will be necessary for us to use particular labels for verb forms. In the middle column is the English rendering of the Hebrew spelling of the different stems. You can see that these are simply phonetic labelings based upon the changes that take place to the verb pa'al, meaning to do or to make, pe, ayin, lamed, in each of the different stems, often called binyan. As we add the different markers of each stem to pa'al, we get a different word. Then that becomes the name of that actual stem. The cal simply means light or swift, and so it is used to refer to the cal stem because the cal stem is boring and nothing actually happens. On the far left is a different way of rendering, although we typically do not use niktal through hitkatel. Instead, we use katal in different formulations of katal to describe what happens within a particular stem or binyan. This will all make sense later, but for now I just simply want you to know that there are 2 different systems for identifying the verbs. Kal, when we're talking about the different stem, nifal, pl, pual, hifel, hafel, and hithbael, and then katal and the various conjugations of katal within a different stem. So if you want to think of kal through hithpael as being more of a global overarching identification of stems, and katal being a definition of the actual changes that take place to a particular verb. This is the typical Hebrew word order in a sentence. Typically, a sentence will include verb, then subject, then the object. For instance, in Genesis 1:1, we have bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Created he, God, the heavens, and the earth with 2 direct object markers, verb, subject, and object. However, poetically and for emphasis, this word order will often be arranged. So while this is the default word order, this is not always the word order. Just as we parse nouns, we also parse verbs in Hebrew. So for instance, this particular word has been parsed as a nifal perfect 3ms from Shema. We are identifying a verb's stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and dictionary form, as well as the definition of that dictionary form. So nifal is the verb's stem, perfect is the aspect or the tense, 3ms is the person, gender, and number, and the dictionary form is Shema, meaning to hear. In my class, I would like you to also write the dictionary definition. So after this line here, you would also write to hear. This slide teaches the very first stem that we will learn in Hebrew, the kal stem. Kal means swift or light. You might even say boring because nothing actually changes throughout the paradigm other than the typical vowel reduction that takes place with a shift in the accent. There are no weird markers, simply the most basic form that you could possibly have of a verb. A comets under the first letter, a patak under the second letter. You'll notice that the subjects are located there in the third column that have been affixed to the perfect paradigm. These are not technically suffixes, but suffirmatives or endings that mark the subject. However, they remain the same in all perfect verbs, so you should become familiar with this chart. You'll notice that there are much similarities between the verb chart and the noun chart. The first common singular is still a yod. The second masculine plural and second feminine plural still end with mem and nun, and the first common plural still ends with a nun shurik. There are other similarities as well, such as the 3fs that ends with a comets hey, and under 2fs you always have a schwa, and under 2ms you have a comets. Just instead of having them under kafs, you now have them under tavs. Again, this is the most basic chart, and it should be learned. Not necessarily learning the perfect paradigm by heart, but learning all the subject endings by heart, and learning what happens when you put them on a very basic verb in the kal stem. Most of the suffirmatives or endings begin with tav. When those are added to a verb that also ends in tav, the two tavs combine and become a tav with a dagesh forte. The same is true of those nouns that end with nun. Many times the nun will assimilate and move into the next nun or into the next tav and be marked by a dagesh forte. Some stative verbs, those verbs that are intransitive, meaning that they do not have a direct object, will have a variable stem vowel, which is the second vowel. Some of them are the same and have comets patak, but some, as here in the middle column, have comets sere, and some even have comets holum over the second letter. You need to at least be familiar that this is an option, although they'll still be easy to identify. These are the three main types of stated verbs with the entire paradigm written out. The ones in the patak that are stative will have patak under the second letter, and the paradigm will look identical to the normal strong verb. Those with sere will have sere in certain stems, but will also look identical in almost every other stem, except the third masculine singular, also having patak under the second letter. The major difference is the holum stative verb, which will have holum over the second letter in most of the stems. In several of them it will reduce to a vocal schwa, although in the second masculine plural and the second feminine plural it will actually reduce to a comets hatuf, which is a short o, so katanten and katantem. These need to be at least familiarized, although they don't necessarily have to be memorized. Perfect verbs are negated with the particle lo, usually meaning not or no. It sometimes may be also spelled completely with a holum vav. Not all verbs will take the same negation, so in many cases the negation is actually an indication of what type of verb you are looking at. Our lessons over the next couple of weeks will be substantially shorter than they were at the beginning of the class. That is because we'll be covering less information per lesson. However, the information that we will be covering per lesson will need to be memorized and known more deeply than the information in the first half of the class. We will be building every lesson on the information in the previous lesson, so be sure to familiarize yourself with the content before moving on. In this particular lesson, the most important thing to memorize is the subject suffixatives or the subject endings on the end of the perfect strong verb, as these will stay the same in all perfect verbs. Remember that katal is very plain, nothing really happens. There are several verb patterns to be aware of, but almost always the first letter will be a kamets, the second letter will be a patak, unless it's a sere occasionally in the stated verb, or a holum also in the stated verb. Other than that, familiarize yourself with this information because it forms the basis for the future lessons.